There's a man who lives in a valley everyone else forgot. He drives a 10-year-old truck with mud on the wheels, wears the same worn jacket, and when he comes into town for supplies, he barely gets a nod. To the people in the bustling farm-to-table markets of a nearby city, he is nobody. A ghost. Just another small-time grower trying to scratch a living from the dirt. But while they were busy building their brands and posting pictures of their heirloom tomatoes on social media, this man, this ghost, was conducting a silent, 5-year calculation. He was watching an entire industry fall in love with its own reflection, and he saw the crack in the mirror. He saw that in the rush to be pure, they'd forgotten to be smart. And he saw that the biggest money in organic food wasn't in being authentic. It was in selling the idea of authenticity. He planned this from the first second. Let me paint the world he entered. Picture the fertile land surrounding a prosperous, health-conscious city. A decade ago, organic was a niche word. It meant something. It meant a farmer you knew, dirt under his nails, crop rotations, patience. It meant a premium paid for a principle. But then, the boom hit. The demand skyrocketed. Suddenly, every restaurant needed a farm-to-table story. Every grocery store needed a dedicated organic section. The consumers, they didn't just want food. They wanted a feeling. They wanted to feel connected, ethical, pure. They were buying absolution by the pound. And into this gold rush came the farmers, the true believers. They mortgaged their land to meet certification standards. They fought pests with ladybugs instead of pesticides, watching whole rows get decimated. They nurtured fragile soil back to life, season after patient season. Their costs were triple. Their yields were half. And they sold their beautiful, imperfect produce at farmers' markets, pouring their souls into every interaction, believing the premium price was a partnership with an educated consumer. But on the other side of the market were the grocery chains and the trendy restaurants. They needed volume, consistency, picture-perfect lettuces, week after week, rain or shine. They needed a story, but they also needed to fill shelves. And between the idealistic small farmer and the voracious commercial buyer, a gap opened. A canyon. The farmers couldn't scale their genuine methods profitably. The big buyers couldn't get enough of the real thing. The market was screaming for a solution, and that's when the opportunists began to whisper. They saw not a problem of agriculture, but a problem of psychology. The consumer couldn't tell the difference. A lab test could, but the customer in the aisle, holding a glossy head of lettuce, they were buying the sticker, the story, the feeling. The certification was just a piece of paper, and papers, as our man in the valley knew, could be managed. This is where we meet the community of the doomed. Not the true farmers. They're irrelevant to this story, destined to remain small and noble. No, the community is the first wave of aggregators, the smooth-talking middlemen. They drive from farm to farm, buying up whatever true organic produce they could find, mixing it together, slapping a unified label on it, Local Harvest Collective, and selling it to stores at a markup. They saw themselves as savvy. They were the wolves, they thought, among the farmer sheep. They'd brag about their margins at trade shows. They'd lease fancy cars. They had the confidence of men who believe they found a clever loophole. Their entire strategy was a shell game. Source real organic when you can, and when you can't, well, fill the order with something that looks close enough. They lived in constant anxiety, scrambling for supply, cutting corners, praying no one would test a batch. Their operation was built on hustle, on stress, on the fear of getting caught. They were greedy, loud, and profoundly, tragically short-sighted. They were playing checkers. And our man in the valley was learning to play a different game entirely. You have to understand him. He wasn't a charismatic wolf. He was quieter than that. Colder. He bought a struggling 50-acre plot at the far end of the valley. The soil was tired. The local farming community wrote him off immediately. He didn't go to co-op meetings. He didn't argue about certification politics. When the aggregators came around, flashing cash, he sold them a few bushels of his mediocre, legitimately grown vegetables at a low price. He played the struggling fool. He listened. He heard their complaints about unreliable supply. He heard the grocery buyers complain about inconsistent quality. He saw the panic in the aggregators' eyes when a big order came in and the real organic farms had a bad season. He absorbed it all in silence. And he saw the hidden opportunity. It wasn't in competing with the aggregators at their own chaotic game. It was in becoming their shadow. It was in building a system so reliable, so consistent, and so seemingly pure that it would become the invisible backbone of the entire local organic market. He wouldn't sell to the end consumer. He would sell to the sellers. He would sell them certainty. His insight was psychological, not agricultural. The market's problem was one of trust. The grocery store needed to trust that the organic label protected them from lawsuits and scandal. The aggregator needed to trust his supply wouldn't vanish. The end consumer needed to trust the story they were being sold. But what if you could manufacture that trust? Not through integrity, but through impeccable documentation and relentless, flawless consistency? What if the product itself was secondary to the theater of its provenance? While the aggregators were running around putting out fires, he began phase 1, invisibility and infrastructure. He divided his 50 acres. On 10 acres, he went utterly, meticulously certified organic. He hired a retired certification agent as a consultant. He documented everything. Every seed, every compost input, every hour of sunlight. This was his show farm. It was beautiful. It was his proof, his shield. The other 40 acres? He practiced something he called calculated cultivation. He used the very minimum synthetic inputs required to guarantee perfect, uniform, bountiful harvests. He used herbicides and pesticides so specific and so timed that they left no detectable residue by the time of harvest, well within the legal limits for conventional produce, but far, far outside the organic rules. His yields on these 40 acres were 4 times that of a true organic farm. His cost was 1/3, but he never, ever commingled the two streams. He built 2 separate washing, packing, and cold storage facilities. 2 separate sets of paperwork. 2 separate realities on one piece of land. Phase 2 was the secret system, the architecture of illusion. He created a brand so bland it was genius. Valley Heartland Produce. No fancy logos, no claims of heritage. Just a name that sounded wholesome and local. He then approached the most desperate of the aggregators, not as a competitor, but as a savior. "I've perfected my methods," he'd say in his quiet way. "I can give you 2 truckloads of photogenic, consistent romaine every Thursday. Same size, same color, same price. Certified. Here are the papers." And he would present the immaculate documentation from his 10-acre show farm. The aggregator, drowning in inconsistency, saw a lifeline. The first delivery was perfect. The second was identical. The grocery buyer was thrilled. The system began to feed itself. Valley Heartland became the silent, reliable partner to 3, then 5, then 10 of these middlemen. They loved him because he asked for no credit, no fame. He just delivered, on time, every time. He was the quiet, boring solution to their most chaotic problem. They never thought to ask how one small farm could produce such industrial-scale consistency. They didn't want to ask. This was phase 3, scaling and market shift. As his revenue grew, he didn't buy a new truck. He reinvested into more cold storage, more logistics software, more of his dual-track system. He began to subtly influence the market. He'd tell his aggregator clients, "I can do certified heirloom cherry tomatoes at a price that will let you undercut everyone at the Saturday market." They'd jump at it. Soon, the farmers' markets, the last bastion of the real growers, were being flooded with Valley Heartland produce sold through these middlemen produce that was cheaper, prettier, and more abundant than the true, imperfect organic stuff. The real farmers were baffled. How could he do it? They assumed he was just a better farmer, or that he was cutting corners on a small scale. They never imagined the magnitude of the operation running in plain sight. The aggregators, now dependent on him, started to pressure the real farmers to match his prices and volume. When they couldn't, the aggregators bought less and less from them, until many of the true organic farms were pushed out of the commercial supply chain altogether, relegated to a tiny direct sale niche. He was methodically strangling the very source of the authenticity he was selling. Then came the Mastermind twist, the real play. It was never about being a supplier. That was just the mechanism. The real play was about controlling the narrative of scarcity. After 3 years, he was the single largest point source of what the market perceived as local organic produce. He waited for a season of bad weather. The true organic farms had a terrible harvest. The aggregators, now wholly reliant on him, came begging. He listened calmly to their panic. Then he said, "The weather has hit us all. My yields are down. The price will have to increase 40%. They screamed. They threatened. But they had no choice. Their contracts with grocery stores were fixed. They had to pay. He had engineered a perfectly legal monopoly. He wasn't selling fake organic. He was selling the certainty of supply in a market he had quietly made himself indispensable to. The price hike wasn't greed. It was the logical conclusion of his strategy. He was now extracting wealth, not just from the land, but from the very market anxiety he had helped create. The shock moment and collapse came swiftly. One of the squeezed aggregators, trying to cut costs, finally got suspicious. He secretly sent a batch of Valley Heartland spinach to an independent lab. The results came back, traces of synthetic compounds. Not enough to be dangerous, but enough to shatter the organic certification. The aggregator, thinking he had caught the quiet farmer, stormed into his office with the report, ready to blackmail him or ruin him. Our man listened. Then he opened a filing cabinet. He pulled out a stack of perfectly legal bills of sale, batch numbers, and shipping manifests. He traced the specific batch in question. The paperwork showed it was sold as grade A conventional produce to a different, wholly separate company, a shell company the aggregator had never heard of. The manifests showed it was shipped to a different warehouse. "This test," the man said softly, pointing to the damning report, "proves someone along your supply chain, with your paperwork mislabeled and commingled product. That's fraud. That's on you." He had planned for this. The 40 acres of conventional produce were always sold legally, through a separate corporate entity, into the conventional wholesale market. Any leak into the organic stream would, by all documented evidence, have to have happened after it left his control. He was insulated. The aggregator left, pale and defeated. He couldn't expose the farmer without exposing his own operation's fatal vulnerability. Within a year, that aggregator was bankrupt, crushed by the margins and the paranoia. 2 others followed. The quiet man in the valley bought their client lists and trucks at auction for pennies. The millionaire ending is not a loud celebration. It's the sight of that same muddy truck parked outside a discreet wealth management office in the city. He owns the valley now. He's purchased the land of several of the failed real farmers, not to farm, but to ensure no one else can. His legitimate 10-acre organic operation is now a PR showcase he tours school groups through. The money, the real money, flows from the 40 acres and the system he built. A system that is, on paper, a marvel of efficiency. He never bribed an inspector. He never forged a certificate. He simply understood the system better than the people who made it. He gave the market exactly what it wanted. A perfect story, backed by perfect paperwork, delivered with perfect consistency. The fact that the story was a carefully constructed fiction was a detail. The market was willfully blind to dot. So what's the psychological power lesson? It's the anatomy of a different kind of mind. The loud aggregators lost because of greed, a hot, desperate, short-term greed that made them sloppy and emotional. The real farmers lost because of pride, commitment to purity that blinded them to the game being played around them. The silent genius won because of something colder, patience. He had the patience to spend years building a dual reality. He had the discipline to never get high on his own supply, to never boast, to never let ego tempt him into the spotlight. His power came from emotional detachment. He wasn't selling food. He was selling a psychological solution to a market inefficiency. He read people not as partners or enemies, but as predictable components in a system. He saw that in a market obsessed with the signifier of quality, the label, the story, the aesthetic, the actual signified quality became a secondary, negotiable expense. He wasn't a farmer. He was a psychologist who used soil as his medium. He won because he understood that the most powerful business moves are often the quietest. That true control doesn't come from dominating the conversation, but from quietly writing the script that everyone else is forced to read from. While they were arguing about ethics and methods, he was building a machine that converted human hope and hypocrisy into silent, dependable cash dot. So ask yourself, as you look at the markets around you, the trendy industries, the moral premiums, the labels people buy to feel better, where are the cracks in the mirror? Where is the gap between what people say they want and what they're actually willing to pay for? Who is the quiet person watching, calculating, building a separate reality in the shadows? And most importantly, which one are you? The one shouting in the marketplace, or the one who planned it from the first second?